Hello, my name is Melissa Hindman. I am a professor at Tyler Junior College. I am the director of the speech and debate team here at TJC, and I have the honor and privilege of being the UIL Prose Poetry Coordinator. And so today, I'm going to talk to you about some hints and suggestions of what you do from beginning to end in an oral interpretation performance. And I have a couple of my students that are going to help illustrate different things as we go along. As a preview for this presentation, we're going to first look at the beginning, which involves cutting your piece or your selections, preparing your script, how you take the front of the room, what you do with your binder and your teaser and your introduction, the introduction itself, how you build emotional levels, and then we'll look at the ending of a presentation, which is the use of pauses, how you build to a climax, and how you hold the moment. So we're going to get down to some pretty nitty-gritties of things that you do as a performer. I'm not going to be able to go into a lot of detail on some of this, going to just kind of hit some of the highlights, but I think it should make you much more familiar with what is expected of you as an oral interpretation student. This quotation from Plato says, "The beginning is the most important part of the work." And I think that that is probably true for an oral interpretation performance, because if you don't get off to a good positive start, it's really difficult sometimes to overcome that in your performance. You certainly can, but it's very important for you to put your best foot forward and to do something positive at the beginning. So let's look at what all that beginning involves. We're going to look at the basics, and the very first is cutting your piece. Cutting your piece to time. Very seldom do you find a prose piece or poetry that is the exact amount of time, that is less than 7 minutes. So here are some suggestions. If you have something that's too long, you need to know what you want to tell. What are you trying to get from that? So the story is what you want to find. And that's true for both prose and for poetry. Now, sometimes, of course, you're going to be using shorter poems. You might use several shorter poems together, and so you're not necessarily having to cut them per se. But either way, you have to know the story that you want to tell. What is your thesis? What is your purpose? And definitely you have to read the entire selections. You have to read all of it multiple times before you can really figure out what the meat or what the real story is that you want to tell. Then I think it helps if you know what your ending is going to be. I always say that you can cut backwards that way. If you know where you want to end your piece, then you can figure out how to begin it. It's much simpler that way than I think it is cutting from the very beginning to the end. Know where you want the ending. Sometimes the ending is not how the author actually ended the piece. Indeed, it can be a different ending, something that's within the story itself. There are so many hundreds of different pointers that I could give you about cutting your piece. Unfortunately, because of time, I'm just having kind of skimmed the surface, but there are some other materials for you to find some hints. But some basic hints for prose is that you cut extraneous characters, little minor characters that don't really mean anything to the story or to the action. That you're just cutting to the storyline itself. I'll tell you a brief example here. Years ago, I had a student doing a cutting from Stephen King's Cujo. And if you know, you probably know Cujo, the movie, but the prose, the novel itself was rather long, and instead of telling the story of Cujo the dog, we didn't mention the dog at all. Instead, there was a story within the story about the mother, and what some things that happened with the mother. And that's the story that we took out of the novel and told just that story itself. So you need to know, what your ending is, where you want to end, what story you want to tell. In poetry, it helps if you can cut complete stanzas or a complete line. It's really difficult to cut poetry like word for word because poetry is already so succinct, and it's more difficult to cut unless you can cut a whole stanza at one whack. But those are just basic pointers of how you can begin your cutting. Now let's look at how you prepare your script, your actual folder. And so I'm going to ask Craig if he will show and demonstrate a good folder and some page protectors.
Yes, ma'am. Here are
So
your page protectors.
those are page protectors, or slicks, also known as slicks. Let me stop the share of this and so that they can really see you. So that's, and show them a folder.
Yes, ma'am. Here, right here is your folder.
With the slicks inside of it, and notice that they have black paper inside of them. That's because to hold it. And notice where the spine, show them that the rings are on the spine itself of the book.
Yes, ma'am.
That because if they're on one side rather than on the spine, it makes it harder to hold. So you want to look for a book that has the rings on the spine itself. Now, these page protectors are not absolutely necessary to have, but boy, they do save you some wear and tear on your pages. That's for certain. So it's a good idea to have them. Now, why a black book? Well, hold the black book just as you normally would, like yeah, in front of you.
Yes,
You
ma'am.
see, even though he has on a blue suit, you can see that the black folder doesn't take away from his clothes. It's not a distraction. And that's why black is the recommended color. Because it just blends in. If he was holding up a red folder or a green folder, it would draw attention to it. And notice that this is the smaller size of folder. You don't want something that is so big it's hard to hold, but this way you can hold this easily in your hand. So that's why. So thank you for showing us that.
Yes,
Now
ma'am.
I'll go back to so you have your good folder, you get your page protectors if you can. They are a little pricey, though I'll warn you, sometimes about the cheapest you can find is 25 cents each. But if your coach is ordering for several of you, you can go in together and get them at a little bit cheaper rate. Then you've got to make sure you know where your page turns are. That's the next step in your preparing your script. And don't think that you just have to fill up a page. You don't. Instead, think where a logical place to turn your page is. You don't ever want to have to turn in the middle of a scene, in the middle of an action, something that's ongoing, because that would be distracting to your audience, and you don't want your page turns to be distracting. You want them to kind of blend in so that people don't even pay attention to your page turns. And by the way, you want to do your page turns from the bottom of the page, not from the top of the page, because that draws more attention to it. So you want to do the page turns from the bottom. Now I'm going to ask Jaquazi to demonstrate and talk about, are your pages thick enough to be easily turned? So Jaquazi, you want to show what your trick is?
Yes, ma'am. So here I have some black cardstock. The reason I like to use cardstock is because it's thicker than normal black copy paper. And personally, I like to cut them in half and do 3 to 6 pieces per page, just because the thicker the page, the easier it is to turn, and you don't want a page turn to stop the motion of your performance. So that's my trick to thickening the pages, and I highly recommend it.
Can you show your actual folder? Show them a
Yes, ma'am.
page or two in your actual folder,
Yes,
so
ma'am.
so that they can see.
So here's my folder. First, this is the outside look of it. Notice how the outside flaps don't touch. That's usually the goal because you want your book to be properly weighted. And so here is a good example of my pages. Notice how thick they are. I don't know if you can really tell, but they're easy to turn and it stops me from being able to struggle. Because a flimsy page, like it struggles because it's so flimsy. So that's why I think in mine.
That's a good term. Yeah, you don't want to struggle with page turns
Yes,
at
ma'am.
all. So that's a very good point. All right, let me go back to sharing my PowerPoint again. So you want your pages thick enough, and you put your black book together, construct it in a way, and of course, your obvious things, you want to make sure that your pages are in the right order. So it helps that if you number them and whatnot. You can even highlight your different character voices in different colors. You can do several different things, but normally you don't want to do anything that's going to be distracting if the audience saw the inside of your book. That's the main thing. So you want to try to keep it as simple as possible, and that's why white pages inside a black book that has black pages inside the slick, that's kind of the norm. That's the tried and true version. Doesn't have to be that way, but it's no rule. I'm just telling you some tricks of the trade. So now you got to hold the folder correctly. So I'm going to unshare my screen again, and I'm hoping that you can see both. I'm going to do so that you can see both of the boys at the same time. And Craig is going to show you the incorrect way that you hold your folder, and Jaquazi is going to show you the correct way. So y'all been called up to the front of the room, so pull up your
Yes,
book,
ma'am.
pull up your books, and say something,
Oh,
Jaquazi. So,
Yes, ma'am.
here's my
all right.
book.
All right, now notice that Craig's is kind of flat or kind of an L shaped, and that is not the appropriate way to hold the book.
Oh, man.
But Jaquazi has his in a V shape, which is the correct way because it's easier for him to turn his pages this way, and it's easier for him to pull it closer to his body and about heart height is what you
Yes,
say.
ma'am.
Notice Craig also has his up too high, a little bit up too high, and his it just doesn't look as professional when it's flat like that.
Oh, man.
So, so thanks, guys. That was a good demonstration here.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to
Yes,
go
ma'am.
back to sharing my screen again. Now that you've got to practice holding your folder correctly several times. That's for certain. So now let's talk about how you take your spot. It's finally your time. You have been called up to the front of the room. So what do? Well, before you even get out of your chair, you need to put yourself in the right mental frame of mind, and you need to have a positive view about your performance. And here's a trick that we teach our competitive students, that you need to have a ritual as you walk to the front of the room, something that you think through that helps you to put you in the right frame of mind to do a good performance. And it might be as simple as that you're walking through a tunnel and you don't see anything other than at the end of the tunnel, you can see your performance and how it's going to go brilliantly. And you're thinking about it, you're thinking about the tunnel and walking through that tunnel, so that you're not thinking about how nervous you are or other things. You're just in the zone. You're putting yourself in a performance zone. So everybody's ritual will be a little different for certain, but you always want to have a positive attitude. Now I'm going to ask Jaquazi if he will show how you hold your black book. So I'm going to unshare the screen again. And Jaquazi, walk up to that front of the room.
Yes, ma'am.
Notice that he pulls the book up and holds it, and then he's going to turn it that way, and then he would say his intro, and then, or his teaser, and then he would go ahead and open it, and he would start his performance. Now, there's not just one positive certain way of doing this, all of this, but notice that his was very smooth and it wasn't awkward. He knew exactly what he was going to do with his book. Folks, the only way you can get that smooth is if you practice, practice, practice. Excuse me. Okay, so you hold the black book, and and you've got to also notice that he is smiling and he's pleasant about it. And now show them how you would sweep the room, what you would do before you. So he's walked up to the front. Now he's doing that eye contact, looking around the room. And again, the smooth opening of the book. Okay, Jaquazi, tell us your story about Zoom. You've been judging some high school Zoom tournaments.
One thing that I've noticed with a lot of Zoom tournaments that's a big no-no, it doesn't look good, is that a lot of students will wait until it's their turn to prepare themselves. I've seen some students even have a chair behind them, and they literally get up and move the chair as their camera's on, as their mic is unmuted. And that to me is kind of just a no-no, because it's like you should already be ready. Have your chair to the side. Have everything set and your camera set so you can just go up and do your performance.
Very good advice. Very, very good advice. Okay, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen again. So now you know about how you take your spot and why that's so important to do, and how you open your folder, and that is when the magic begins. Folks, here's what I'm going to tell you. This is the big concept about oral interpretation competition. It's your 7 minutes of time. It's not the judges, it's yours. It's your performance. And so you need to take control. So that means that you've got to be confident in yourself, and you've got to be confident that you know how to begin the performance. So that's why all these little tidbits that we talked about are important, so that you know how to make it your 7 minutes of time. Next, we're going to talk about how you use your folder or binder in your teaser and in your introduction. We're going to look at how you hold your black book, how and when you close your black book, and how you reopen your black book. So for this, I'm going to ask Craig to come back, and he's going to do a demonstration.
Yes, ma'am. Growing up, my father's goal in life was to make sure I grew up to be a real man. By the time I was 4, he would take me to the shooting range, and it was funny because a Smith & Wesson 45 was the size of my arm. Then about 2 or 3 years later, he would take me on driving lessons. And it was funny because I would sit in his lap and my legs would dangle and I couldn't even reach the pedals. Then about every 2 or 3 weeks, he would have a special treat, which was changing a tire. Because for some reason, he thought by changing a tire, it would start the evolution of manhood. According to the 2019 article from the New York Times, traditional masculinity can hurt young boys. In our society today, young men and boys are subjected to a kind of toxic masculinity, a stereotypical idea of what being a real man is. Why do we hold on to these old definitions and labels that should have been exiled long ago? It is time we move past these lingering problems. Stories in the news today celebrate different types of masculinity, but what is the right type? And how do we raise these young men to be good boys? In this piece today, we examine a humorous yet unsettling look at masculinity. Real men don't rob banks. By Lil Levonics.
Okay. So notice that he walked up to the front of the room with his folder closed, and then he took the stage, he took his moment, he opened his folder to do his teaser, then he closed the folder to do the introduction, because the introduction is where we meet you. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit, but that's meeting you. And then he opened it back up to start the performance. Now you want to make sure that you pause at least 1 to 2 full seconds before you close and open your folder each time. That way you're not rushing it. Okay, I'm going to go back to sharing. Thank you, Craig.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
And going on now to our next slide. We're talking about introductions. Notice that when Craig did his intro for you, it was memorized, but natural delivery, because this is when you want to meet the person. You want to definitely follow the requirements of your category in UIL rules. It tells you what the requirements are for your introductions. Obviously, you have to tell your titles and your authors, or authors if there's multiple. But you also, there may be some particular things. I don't want to get into the different categories, but just make sure you know what those are and show the significance of your piece, or why it's important to share. And so I'm going to ask Jaquazi to do another intro for you so you see yet another example. So let me stop the share.
Yes, ma'am. Social distancing is an oxymoron. It's hard to be social when you are distant. The Mayo Clinic website, updated this month, states that a connection with people is an inherent aspect of our human society. We need people to lean on during life's most stressful challenges. This biological programming drives us to gather in groups and communities that oftentimes shield us from mental and physical harm. The article insists that we should prioritize the need for community, even during a pandemic, later stating that social distancing and social isolation are a double pandemic. Using Crown, an ode to the fresh cuts by Derek Barnes, Cutting Along the Color Lines, Black Barbers and Barbershops in America by Quincy Mills, The Poetry, The Two B's by Bud Simmons, The Black Barbershop, a film from Sandstorm Productions, Stone Ghost in the South, an NBC News report, the rap song Murphy's Revenge by the rapper Murs, and The Power and Politics of the Black Barbershop, an essay by Jason Parham, a program on community. Because during these troubling times, It is important for us to connect with one another and our communities. It's time to put on our mask and head back to the barbershop.
Okay, thank you, Jaquazi.
Welcome.
That particular intro is for a program oral interpretation that he is doing on barbershops, as you might guess. But you notice how the introduction definitely showed the significance, not only because of us being in a pandemic right now, but how we all need communities and the importance of communities. So not only did he tell all the titles and the authors following the requirements, but he showed the significance. And he had natural delivery as well. So it makes it a good introduction. Okay. Oh, wait. Caution, yellow. There's a middle part. You don't just have beginnings and endings. You do have a middle part of your performance preparation. And that's where you decide how to build the emotional levels within your piece. And I'm going to tell you over and over again, analyze your material. You analyze that prose story, you analyze your poetry, you read it, you think about it line by line, you think about what all it means, why the author wrote what they wrote. You have to understand why you're telling this story. Why are you telling it? One of the things that I write on ballots the most are think the thoughts before you say the words. I think that makes you a more natural performer if you're thinking the thoughts as if you're thinking them for the first time. So you think the thoughts before you say the words. And another thing I write frequently on ballots is that you have to be real in your reactions, that you can't be fakey, it can't be manufactured. Oh, I'll show surprise at that point. You know, it's got to be real. It's got to come. We talk about it being the heart-head connection that within your piece, that you have got to think about it and analyze it enough that you have that heart to head connection. You know what's going on to be real. All right, so we've talked about the beginning, we've talked about the middle. So now I found this quotation about endings from Frank Herbert, who says there is no real ending, it's just the place where you stop the story. And I think that's very appropriate, whether it's prose or poetry, because you do choose where you're going to end that particular performance. But there are some basics, again, of how you can make your ending even more special, make it work even better. So first, let's look at pauses. I put down, you want to think the thoughts again, because that is one of the essential keys. You want to think about what you're saying and to make it as conversational and as natural as possible. So you are going to put in some pauses, but there is such a thing as too many pauses. My colleague that I coach with here is famous for saying that nobody but forensic people talks in this manner, and this would be her explanation. That sometimes forensic people put a pause in between every single word. And she said, nobody talks like that. You know, nobody pauses between every single word. And I think that definitely sometimes that the students do that they put in too many pauses. So while you do want to have some pauses, you don't want to just read nonstop. You don't want to put in too many as well. It has to be conversational and natural. That's what you're looking for. You also want to have a variety in your to build to your climax. You want to be very real in those reactions. You want, and you can build to a climax through variety in rate, like speeding up or slowing down. One way or the other could build to a climax. A variety in your volume can help you to reach a climax. But please, please, please realize that you don't have to shout every time to do a climax. All climaxes are not shouting at the judge in the room. That's not necessarily accurate either. So it needs to be very real. There's probably some very subtle nonverbal cues that you can do to help build to a climax as well. Little body shifts and things that you would do naturally in a conversation. So think about all of those things to help you build to a climax. And then finally, you want to hold the moment of the absolute ending of your piece. And I'm going to talk about it, and then I'm going to ask Jaquazi to demonstrate for you. But you want to hold that moment. You don't want to break too soon. You don't want to slam your folder closed. You've got to let the audience absorb the final thought that you have just said. So you want to hold for at least 2 seconds before you close your book. And that, man, I can't tell you how many hundreds, maybe thousands of times I've written that on a ballot, that the students just came to the end of the piece and then they snap that folder close and like it's the end. And that's just not an appropriate way to build a good ending. So Jaquazi is going to figure out a place that he can kind of begin the end of his prose piece that he's competing with this year. And he's going to just start midway here. I mean, this is at the end of it, but he's going to do the very ending.
Yes, ma'am. And the surgery goes great. Sean and I recovered together in our own little honeymoon. Today, we received a card in the mail from my mother. Now, it is not unusual for my mom to send us cards. She sends them for the strangest occasions. But this one was addressed to Sean. It talked about what a blessing he was, and it even congratulated us on our kidney-versary. And she even invited us to dinner, like normal couples do with their parents. And I didn't ask for proof, because in these situations, you're supposed to rely on faith. And now I have a loving husband, a family that accepts us, and a 10-inch scar across my abdomen that reminds me every day that I am loved.
And then the applause starts. So thank you, Jaquazi. So you see how he kept that pause, he held it, he built that climax, he illustrated everything that I said that a speaker should do in a good performance, that he didn't break too soon. He let the audience absorb that final thought, that he was loved, and that felt really, really good. So hold for those 2 seconds before he closed the book. And you notice how he closed the book, and then yet he took yet another pause before he would turn and walk off to the side. And so that is, ideally what you want to do. You want to build those moments and then hold that ending, hold it. And if you want to make a big impact, which I'm assuming you do if you're doing prose or poetry here in UIL competition, I strongly suggest that you use these tips and these things that we've been talking about in today's workshop. The process really is pretty simple. You find your material, you analyze your material, and then you practice, practice, practice. That's the three main steps. I'm not going to lie to you. Sometimes finding your material may be the most difficult step. I mean, finding the right pieces for you might take the longest. Sometimes you might find the material rather quickly, but then getting it cut, getting it analyzed, that may be what takes the longest. But as far as the practice, 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 I will tell you that we have a saying on our team that you need to be up on your feet, saying it out loud every day. There is no substitute, absolutely no substitute for practice. You can't fake it, you have to practice. So I definitely wanted to get that plug in. Now, here's a plug that I want to give for using the UIL Prose and Poetry Handbook. This is now a free digital copy. You can find it on the UIL website, and I've given you the information here, or you can search for it yourself. But this is a great handbook that Jana Riggins and some of the other people in the Prose and Poetry Committee have written, giving you suggestions of all different aspects of how to prepare your events from beginning to end. So please, please, please take advantage of this free resource book, because it goes into more detail on some of these things than I was able to go into today. It's kind of a summary of what we've talked about. We talked about how the beginnings of a performance are setting the stage. They are setting it up, getting your audience ready for your performance. And your endings is the crescendo, if you know that musical term, the big crescendo, and also the theatrical term of closing the curtain, letting the audience go, ah, yeah, that was a great lesson, or that was a great message that story or that poem came across. Remember that there are so many different levels to make a solid performance, and you can't skip any of them. You've got to go through all these different stages that I've talked about today if you're going to have a really complete and solid performance that's going to last and get you through district and regionals and to state competition. I want to give a special thanks to both Jaquazi and Matthew Craig today for their demonstrations. They helped put the puzzle pieces together, I think, explaining some of the aspects of it, and that was fun to do. And if you have any questions whatsoever, you can find me at my email address there at Tyler Junior College, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you have. And I hope that you've enjoyed today's workshop on the beginnings and the endings of oral interpretation. Have fun performing.